Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Certification course. Everyone in the auditorium can be seated. Welcome all of you that are watching online, whether it be our Facebook page or the Peaceful Solution app. We'd like to welcome all of you. Once again, we're going to be picking up in the respect unit, and I hope by now everybody's got one. I haven't got any emails in the last couple weeks asking for one, so that tells me a lot of people are getting used to downloading the books. But if you have any questions, please always feel free to, you can message us on Facebook. Just go ahead and readily do that on the official Peaceful Solution, which is what you're watching right now. Or you can also send us an email at info@peacefulsolution.org. So it's info@peacefulsolution.org. We're going to pick back up where David left off last class, and we're not going to do much of a review in the beginning because this class is going to pretty much be a review of the chapter. We're going to go through the what I have learned, and that's going to help us put together chapter 3, which is respecting others, which of course was building on chapter 2, respect for myself, and that's going to help us carry on to chapter 4, where we'll learn to tie into respect to society. But if you'll turn over to LP3, page E, we're going to go ahead and reread the procedure. Now, David finished this procedure, but the reason we're reading it because we're going to be on page 66, but page 66 is not listed in the next procedure. So we're going to finish out the procedure that David was covering, and the page is not listed, but we know it's there, and we need to cover it in the procedures that are required for these things to be covered. So here on procedure 8, it says, tell students that showing respect to the opposite sex is also an important aspect of positive relationships. Explain to students that part of growing up is accepting that there will be physical changes in both males and females. Respecting those of the opposite sex includes not making comments about their body or touching them inappropriately. Have students turn to page 64 through 65 in their handbooks and read the section entitled How to Show Respect to the Opposite Sex, and of course, in straight talk, and tell students that disrespecting the opposite sex is called sexual harassment. It is immoral and is against the law. And of course, you'll notice page 66 is not mentioned there, so we're going to cover that. But just to go along with what was said there, and of course, David finishing that out, once again, note it's not just wrong morally, but you can actually be charged with a crime. A lot of people lose their job every day because of sexual harassment. And in today's society, this can come in many different forms. It used to be a touch, which is very inappropriate, or a very direct comment, an inappropriate comment. That also could be considered, is immoral and against the law. But in today's society, it's much more detailed to where you can just do an action of something. Kind of give a hint of something, try to say something without saying it, or say something inappropriate that one person might not like. I'll give you an example of what a sportscaster said. These are not my words, so don't go saying that I'm being a sexist here. But they were making, and I'm not going to go into great detail because it kind of draws too much of a picture in your mind. But there was a announcer that got in a lot of trouble he's a golf broadcaster, and I don't watch golf, so I'm not familiar with the broadcaster. But one day he was explaining how it's easier for men to swing the club than women. And he kind of went into detail right there on national TV. And he almost lost his job over it, but he did get suspended for a long time because that in itself, they labeled that as harassment, that he was harassing someone. They called it sexist, but they also labeled it as harassment. So we have to be careful with how we say things, especially if we're kind of unveiling something that really shouldn't be talked about in a public kind of conversation. If you're in a class that's discussing anatomy and health, and you're going to a medical school and things of that sort, that's one thing. But to look at somebody and to start discussing their body features and to say, well, you must be better or you can't be as great as someone else because of this, this, and this, that's a very inappropriate thing to do. It should never be done. And if you've ever been done that way, especially in public, you could pretty much understand why it would be considered degrading. But looking over to page 66, we're going to cover more on that as we do the review tonight. So we'll go back in. We will end up reviewing that, but we're going to review the whole chapter. But we need to go through page 66 first, and it says what it all boils down to. It is important to establish respect for an individual's privacy and personal space. We went through that a lot with COVID. That's one thing that you really learned with COVID was how to keep a distance between people. This creates a value system which helps people to recognize the limits and avoid violating the privacy of others. And remember, a value system is what you deem to be important. And as we progress and we get into the high school series of the Building Moral Excellence, we'll go through another test of our value system. And everybody, you could have, as we've said before, you can have 10 different people and have 15 different things that are listed as valuable and have them list the most important valuable thing to them from 1 to 15. And you can have 10 different people listed, and you can have 10 different, completely different value systems, and they can all be right. It doesn't mean they're wrong. If you don't own a car and the car is on the list, well, that's going to be close to the bottom because you're not really valuing that. If you've ever dealt with rental properties before, you'll know that a person that rents a house does not value a house as much as the person who owns the house. People in the rental business learned that very quickly. Just like if you let someone borrow your car, they don't really care too much for the little dings and the scratches, and they don't even notice the things that you'll notice from a mile away. You know, so these are things that we get into, and of course this personal space. If you've ever been talking to someone and they get right up in your face like this, and that's usually done when emotion is going, you know, anger is kicking in, things of that sort, as we covered in chapter 2 and 3 of the self-control unit. But people can also come up and, you know, you're working on something, they'll put their arm around you and they'll get right up against you, or they want to whisper in your ear till you feel their whiskers or whatever else rubbing your ear. And me personally, I'm not the kind of person that wants to feel somebody's whiskers rubbing my ear. That's just not me. To me, that's a little bit too close, you know. I looked at it this way. If anyone was ever going to do that, it would have been my father when he was raising me and teaching me. And that's the only person I would have felt comfortable with doing that. As a young boy, he would have been instructing me. But we have to remember, you know, these things, although we might think that just walking in and grabbing somebody and giving them a hug and stuff, we might think, well, that should be okay. Well, it doesn't mean it is, just because we think it is. A value system, for one person, you might think that, this is okay. For another person, they might think, absolutely not. You know, it's like some of the countries we've traveled to, many different countries. In some countries, you shake a hand. In some countries, they give you a kiss. The men and the women do, on your cheek. You know, so you learn very quickly to, whenever you're introducing, you start doing stuff like this. You know, and it's not that you want to be disrespectful, but they realize that this is something that you're not into. And people will be respectful of it. But you wouldn't want to go to a country where they're not practicing it. Like if you're here in the United States, you wouldn't want to go into Walmart and see your best buddy there and give him a kiss on the cheek if it's not something neither one of you are used to doing. Because, well, I seen this on the Travel Channel the other night. This is what best friends do. You know, so you gotta keep everything, you know, in mind of what rules are and respect these things. Because privacy, and you think about personal space as personal property, like a house, you know, or you have someone who owns something. But our bodies themselves are private property. You own your body. You're responsible for what you put into your body. And you're responsible for what you allow to take place with your body. Now, granted, there's some people that at a young age can go through some horrific things, and there's some people that can be done in a very inappropriate way through violent acts that disrespect the person's body, such as rape or molestation. And sometimes even down to the youth, even infants, and it's sad to say, kind of hard for an infant to defend itself, kind of hard for a very young child to defend itself if it's somebody who they trust in. And of course, when you get into other things such as rape, well, it's kind of hard to defend yourself, but then you might want to examine, can I avoid anything like that from not putting myself in that position? Sometimes these things can be avoided just by not following the crowd and the peer pressure and the conformity that comes with it. So think about that as we turn back over to procedure 9. because this does go into the next procedure, page 67. And of course, you'll find out this chapter, even after we get through what I've learned, there's still a quiz and there's a scenario to go through, quite a lengthy scenario that kind of goes into instructing and guiding a student about what it's like and the repercussions of, picking on someone and being hard to someone. And we'll get to that when the time comes, but it can be a very emotional thing where we can look at each other right now. And I want everybody to think about this very seriously. And whether you're watching online, if you're watching with a group of people, look around at the people. If you're not, look outside at the people. Someone's going to pass away. Someone's going to suffer. Someone's going to die. Someone's going to become very ill. And who can tell which person that will be, or the next person that's even in this auditorium? Who knows? Who can guess that? Now, if you've ever had the experience, I know you young men might not have ever experienced this. I know some of the older men might have, to where you might not have been part of this, but you've seen someone that was picked on, ridiculed, made fun of, and then that person dies. And then all of a sudden, the people that ridiculed and picked on and made fun of, they start to feel bad. But a lot of people, well, I'm going to go to the funeral home and pay my respects. It's better to pay your respects to someone when they're alive. We need to get past the rest in peace that's put on the gravestone and put live in peace. It's time to start putting peace into our lives and not waiting till someone dies before, we should have made things better. And this is pretty common in society, where people will be arguing or fighting or they have grudges, and these things can carry on for years. But when they die, the person goes and gives a eulogy. Or they want to say something great about the person they just fought with for 30 years. These are things we should deal with while people are living and work towards and value and respect every day of life. Otherwise, we can find ourselves so confused thinking that everything's going to be okay. Nothing's going to change. Nobody's going to get hurt. Nobody's going to die. If you drive by the cemetery, you got to realize people are dying to get in that place. You can't get in there alive and stay. They're going to tell you to leave. And the cemetery is getting bigger every day. People aren't getting up and moving right now. That's a story for a different day, I think. But continuing on here, procedure 9, it says, have students to complete the activity on page 67 and briefly discuss their answers. Conclude the lesson by encouraging students to make respecting others a top priority, notice, in their lives, while you're living, while you're interacting with people, while you have the opportunity to do it. Have students turn to page 68 in their handbooks and read the section entitled, What I've Learned. Remind students that respect for others is the basis of all positive interaction and helps to build strong relationships. Stress that as people, we need to know that others value and appreciate us. That's very important. We need to know that. Not that we need to do that also, which is very important, but we also need to know that people value and appreciate us. That's an extremely important part of keeping a healthy mentality. And by the same token, we need to show value and appreciation and respect for others. So turning over here to page 67, and of course, this is something you will do with your class, and the instructions are on the top. And it says, on the lines provided, write some ways respect can be shown to others. For example, one way we can show respect for others is by paying attention to what others are saying. And you notice this tree here that's sitting there at the very bottom. It says, respect is the root of all positive relationships. Now, when you think about a tree, and this would be very important for you to go online and show your students. Most people never know what a tree looks like when it's underground. If you've ever had the job of clearing off land that had trees on it, and you think the only thing that's there is what's on top, you'll find misery when you start digging through the ground, especially here in Texas where it's sand, and you find there's roots and roots and more roots, and you'll break more tools and twist more tools. And you can even bring out the big equipment like the Kubota skid steers, and you'll run that drill in the ground and twist it in half too. I know from experience. I've learned the hard way. These roots are very damaging, but you don't see the very sophisticated system. Here in Texas, the trees are starting to turn green again. For those of you that are leaving summer and going into autumn, well, we're going into spring. And here, everything is starting to turn green again. You start to see the beauty. You know, Texas winter, everything gets really ugly. But when the trees start blooming again, the flowers start coming up, you start seeing the beauty of the trees, and you notice everything above the ground. But you never consider the enormous lifespan and the intricate detail in the maze of the root system that's underground that even ties into the water underground. You know, and that's how a tree can stay green in Texas, even through a very lengthy drought, because it's tapped into that life source. Its roots have gotten there to where the water's at, and tree roots will find water. If you have a house where you run water outside your house, or if you have what they call weeping willow trees, they will find your septic system. They will find whatever they can to find that source of water. Now think about a tree actually knows what to get and where to get it from. Now that's very important, but it's important that they realize that a tree that's weak, a tree that's not deeply rooted, blows over in the Texas wind pretty easy. And I've seen that recently even out here where we live, trees that were blown over because we had very windy days in the last couple weeks. And some trees blew over. And I purposely went to look at the tree, and I seen where the roots wasn't very deep, but the trees beside of it still stood. And it is pretty interesting to see how some trees can be stronger than others, and it's because of the rooting system that they pull themselves into. And of course, character education is the same way. Peace can only come through education. And that education is the lifeline. And our studies and the application of this is that root system, where we dig ourselves into this system and we connect ourselves to that lifeline. And it's those things that actually will give life to the body, to the individual, and bring peace to society. One day we're going to be able to turn on the TV without seeing world leaders calling for emergency UN meetings because nuclear weapons, ballistic weapons, or tactical nuclear weapons are being moved around and put at nations' borders. One day we're going to experience these things. You know, whenever you spend trillions of dollars on these things, building weapons to annihilate others is not a form of respect. And you cannot force someone to respect you. If you and I were having a conflict, and I go get the biggest gun I can find that will annihilate not only you, but your whole property, and I keep it pointed at you 24/7, that's not going to make you like me. You might comply with what I ask you to do until you can get a gun to point back at me. And then we can say, well, now you crossed the line, I'm going to shoot you. Well, I'll shoot you first. Well, if I see you shoot, I'm going to shoot back. Well, and think about the disrespect that's being shown to the human race by a very few group of people that are arguing and complaining. I dare say these people that are developing these weapons and putting these things together do not speak for society. They speak for a small group in society. But I'm sure there's billions of people, whether it be 1, 2, so forth, that would like to have peace and not war. And we're going to see that. But keep that in mind and going through that with your students. But once again, get into that with that tree. That's why it's there, to show the deeply rooted system. And of course, remember that lifeline is education. And have them write down one way they can show respect by paying attention. You know, by paying attention to what others say is one way. And of course, have them give others examples. There's many that have been given so far, and we're going to go back through some of them tonight. So looking over to page 68, this is the What I Have Learned section, and hopefully we get through this whole section tonight. There's a lot of things to rehearse, and sometimes it's better to go back to chapters before and also other books to pull these things together. But the very first bullet point here in What I Have Learned, and if you can go ahead and put up, I forgot, we made some slides for this. For those of you, we have a lot of people that do not have the book with them at this time, and someone asked me tonight if we would be able to put these up, so I want to make sure they're put up so people can see them. And going on to the next slide is the first bullet point, so everybody can see it, and that way you'll have time to write it down if you don't have your book with you. Treating others with respect is just as important as respecting myself. So that's something we have learned, and that's something we have applied. But I want to bring everybody's memory back to, once again, reading this. Treating others with respect, that's what we covered in this chapter, is just as important as respecting myself. That's what we covered in chapter 2. So if you could be turning back over to page 25, and this is in chapter 2, and this is just to remind us of the importance of respecting ourselves, so we can get into respecting others. But it's very important that we always remind ourselves that it always begins with ourself first. When a person doesn't respect themselves, that's a very deadly disease. And I say a very deadly disease because it can spread. When a person is pessimistic, always negative, never sees they never see a way out of anything. It leads to depression. And we've talked about that. All four teachers have talked about that, myself, David, William, and Katan. And depression is not a joke. Depression is not something that you can just, wash off your face like dirt. When someone allows depression, and I say allow because it's something that kind of like can grab a hold of you and it starts squeezing. And you got to really work against it before it squeezes the life out of you, because it can squeeze you so hard you hurt. And if you don't get help or talk to someone, isolating yourself during depression is never the thing to do. Why? Because, there's always other people. We tend to think when we go through depression, if you've ever been through this, you're the only one going through it, and everybody else's life is great. You can create this most fictitious story that everything is going all to pieces in your life and everybody else is finding success. And that's really not true. If I was to ask everybody in this auditorium, who here has problems? Everybody's going to put their hand up because we all have problems. That's just part of life. And if you don't have problems, then you probably didn't realize it, but you will by the time you leave here tonight, that we all have problems. But I say it's a very deadly disease because we went over before how many people take their own lives every year, just in the United States. And how many people take the lives of unborn children. We're talking millions and millions of people because of bad choices, because they've been bullied, because one thing or another hasn't worked out in their life, financial ruin, bankruptcy, they've committed a crime and they're embarrassed. There's a lot of reasons why people take their own lives. And if you've done something that's inappropriate and you're facing 30 to 40 years in prison and you're 20 years old, that would be very depressing. And some people have went through this. In fact, I remember when I was a young man watching the treasurer of Pennsylvania, who was embezzling money, and this was either the late 70s or early 80s. I remember on national television him pulling a gun out of his briefcase and shooting himself in the mouth on national television. And nobody knew he was going to do it. And there was a show called Faces of Death that jumped on that really quickly, and they showed that, and they put that on tapes. But the man had gotten caught, and instead of facing prosecution, that was his way of getting out of it. He didn't really get out of it. He ended everything, but it was due to the depression of the regret of what he had done. But here on page 25, respect for myself, look at the very top of the page again, and we've read this a few times, but it's important to keep putting these things into our minds. As human beings, we learn through repetition. That's how we truly get things down. And it says, I am a part of the human race. I belong to the most intelligent life form on the planet. I am special and unique, and I am worthy of respect. And here, the very first paragraph, it says, the greatest thing you can value is life. Now, I want you to think about that when we're talking about respecting others and respecting ourselves. If you value life, do you really put forth any effort in creating things that cause death? If you truly value life. If you value life, do you spend $1 trillion a year on things that bring death, that bring annihilation, that destroy? Could you imagine if we took NATO's budget, just the countries in NATO, if we took their budget, which is 2 or 3% of all countries that are involved, which don't really pay, but that's their agreement. If we just took that, imagine what we could do with the budget NATO has. Just NATO's money. And then look at the United States and even China now, who's starting to spend an enormous amount of money. They're still nowhere close to what the United States spends. Just imagine if we spent that much money on peace. And if you're out there, you should ask your local congressman and senator, how much money have we spent on war? And then when they tell you, how much the military budget is, how much are we spending on peace this year, by the way? Well, they'll tell you, that is peace. But once again, if me and you get in a confrontation, or you and I get in a confrontation, and we both pull out a gun, How does that bring peace to the situation? It doesn't. It doesn't solve the situation. It elevates, it intensifies. And these things are not positive in the minds of the most intelligent race on the planet. Continuing on, it says, having respect will enable you to handle life's challenges in a positive way and avoid making choices that could have a negative impact on your life. Developing self-respect is much like a muscle that grows stronger from regular exercise. It's the same way the peaceful solution works and character education works. The more you use it, the more you study it, the more you remind yourself of it, the more you go to class, the more implementation you have of it going into your life, the stronger it becomes. And it's also like a muscle to the point to where when you quit studying, you quit coming to classes, you quit implementing it into your lives, it starts to weaken. You start to forget it. You start to not remember, I was supposed to do that. You know, it's never a great situation to get at the end of something and then realize, I should have done all these things and it would have turned out better. You know, and I even know better. I've been taught to do these things. But we can find ourselves in those situations. All of us can. But once again here, finishing up, it says, one of the best ways to start respecting your life is to value it. You have to deem it to be important. And think about it. You know, especially you young guys sitting there. I remember when I was 10 years old, and I remember I had a cousin who, I remember him telling me he was 30, I think it's 31 or 32, something like that. And I remember sitting there going, man, you are old. 31 years old? And now that I'm 50, I start thinking, well, one, where did life go? You know, I don't remember 50 years worth of living here. But 50 doesn't seem so old anymore. 50 seems very young because life goes by extremely fast. And you have to make of it, you know, when you're young, you think that, you know, life is fun. We go to school, we go and play, we do this, we do that. And then the reality sets in one day that I got to get a job. I got to work. This food just doesn't appear in my refrigerator. What do you mean the lights don't work if you don't pay money? I flip the light switch on, it comes on. Water comes through the faucet. I got to pay to live here? Yeah, and then you find out an enormous amount of your life will be spent working. That's why if you don't respect your finances, which is part of respecting yourself, you can find yourself working every day of every year, and at the end of your life, you're completely broke and have nothing to show for it. So you have to value your life enough to see the end goal. You know, getting to the end of your life and having lots of money, well, that doesn't mean success. Even though you might die and the other people get it, they'll think you were very successful because you left them money. But success is measured on what did you contribute back to society. And that's important to remember. So once again, you notice it's great to be alive, but, you know, there's no guarantee for tomorrow for us. Notice it says when you learn how to respect yourself, you will have an even greater appreciation of the needs to respect others. So once again, when we learn to respect ourselves, we're going to learn to respect others. And that's what we're talking about. The combination of respecting yourself and others will enable you to interact in healthy, meaningful ways. And they'll help you build healthy, meaningful relationships. Looking over to page 26, you'll see it says self-respect. At the very top is knowing who you are. That doesn't mean just your name. It also means what you stand for, as you notice here, and what you value. Self-respect also involves caring about yourself physically and mentally to promote positive growth and development. Now, we went over how you're affected physically and mentally through your actions and decisions. And I would encourage you to go back and listen to all of those classes we brought. But our decisions, even though we think they might not affect us mentally or physically, we'll find out later on in our lives that it can have a devastating effect on our lives. But here, right down below that, you see, why is learning to respect myself important? The ability to respect yourself is important for your growth and development. Without self-respect, you could be prone to make choices that can have negative consequences. Many of these choices will come from a need to fit in with friends in order to feel a sense of belonging. Now, keep that in mind and turn back over to the next chapter here. We're going to go to page... let's look at page 32 first, because that also had some things we need to get in before we go back over to page 51. But page 32, notice self-respect can be a part of your character. Notice here it says evaluate yourself or evaluating yourself. And this is something we should do on a daily basis, something we really should do on a weekly basis. You know, we talked about writing things down that we fall short in, writing things down that we know we need to do better. You know, the reason we write them down, when we get to the responsibility unit, you'll learn that people who accomplish goals write them down. And that's why we're going ahead and trying to get that into our minds, to get it into our activities, to get it, make it part of us, to make it a habit. Write these things down. And notice it says, as an individual, it is essential in achieving self-respect. Remember, people who have self-respect will not allow others to talk them into doing something that is morally wrong. So they won't talk themselves into allowing someone to have them do something or talk them into participating into doing something that brings harm to themselves, someone else, or the environment. And with that in mind, turn over to page, due to the time, and we've already covered those pages, but we want to go back over to the chapter that we're reviewing, but we want to get that into our minds first. And here on page 51 at the very top, and this is in chapter 3, respect others. It says, respect others. The benefits are unlimited. And when you think about it, how can you actually go wrong by showing respect to someone? How can you actually bring something negative from doing something positive? You know, other people might bring negative things into the situation, but taking a positive action will not bring a negative. Now, sometimes we might think, because we didn't think it through thoroughly, that, no, what I'm doing is okay. Yeah, I'm completely convinced this is positive. And then when someone hurts or someone suffers, we go back and realize, well, I probably should have did it a little differently. Now, all positive decisions doesn't mean that people aren't going to hurt. It's a positive thing to tell people what they're doing is wrong, even if they're still doing it and they don't want to quit. It's a positive thing to tell them if they don't stop, they're going to suffer. That's positive. Even though there's a negative outcome from people that don't listen to it, it's still a very positive thing to educate people. And that is part of respecting others. But looking down here on page 51, it says, the very first paragraph, how many people have you had contact with today? Did you interact with family members? Did you walk with friends to school? Or did you take the school bus? If you live in a big city, you probably saw hundreds of people on your way to school. With so many people every day that sometimes we forget that every person we see has value. And I can tell you, I recently went to a place that never been to a city this big, but I went to a city of 28 million people. I have never seen so many people in one place in my life. And it was a city of very poor people that Americans, you almost got to see it to understand it, because you don't see anything like this in America. And to realize that these people are just as valuable as the people in the United States. They don't have what we have. The average salary there is $240 a month, and that's if you can find a job. And you still have to pay your lights, your rent, and then buy your food. And most people there don't have cars. They're riding city buses. And I can tell you, they have city buses like we have here. They look very old, but I have never seen so many people packed into a bus in my life. And you think about how these people, and I almost wanted to take a picture, but I thought it would be derogatory to do so, because I didn't want it to look like, I was amazed with what I seen, but I did want it to look like a spectacle. But there was nowhere left to stand in that bus. I'm talking the person's nose was in the back of the person's head in front of them. All the seats were filled, and I don't know if they had a seating capacity on that bus, but they were way over the seating capacity. Because it was, and they were still trying to pick up people, because there they blow the horn when they see groups of people to try to pack the bus full more. And I was surprised when I seen the driver, he was blowing his horn and trying to pick more people up. And I thought, where are you going to put them? They're packed so tight, nobody can move. And how would you like to be the person in the back that's got to get off the bus? I don't even know how that works. You know, you would think that they must take them to a central location and everybody gets off. But this is everyday life. And not just that city, all around the world. This is everyday life. And we have, we're really blessed. We live out here in the country. It can be nice and quiet. In the United States, especially in Texas, you'll hear a gun go off every now and then, somebody shooting a wild animal or so forth. Now, they would think that's crazy, because in a city of 28 million people, you hear a gun go off, everybody's running for their lives. It's not like out here, you hear one go off, it doesn't mean that much. But this respect of others and the value of others, we'll get into other things as we move forward, but we have to remember, everyone we see has value. It doesn't matter how nice their clothes are. It doesn't matter how eloquent they speak. It doesn't matter, if their hair's blue or blue. Yes, blue. I've seen blue hair, or green or yellow or purple or black, or, the standard colors of blonde. But these things don't really define a person of who they are. But continuing on, it says, can you imagine how your life would be if you had no family or friends? Some people find themselves in that situation, but you have to put yourself in that situation. You can always make friends. Even if your family's all gone, you can always make friends. Continuing with the last sentence in that paragraph, it says, when we imagine not being able to interact with anyone, we can begin to comprehend just how valuable human life is. You can go into depression when you don't have human interaction. And it says, continuing in the next paragraph, there is no doubt that people need people. We need to know that someone cares about our health, safety, and well-being in order to have joy and reach our full potential in life. We convey care and concern through positive interaction. For any interaction to be positive, there must be respect. So that interaction, there must be respect. And looking over to page 52, you see here that we have 3 basic rules listed in the activity. It says, in chapter 1, you learn that basic respect must be shown to all people and that everyone has the right to be respected. And of course, we learned that. If you want it for your notes, we went over it on page 9. On page 9 is in chapter 1, and it was entitled Basic Rules for Respecting All People. And of course, it said, always remember that people have value and must be respected. And these are 3. These are not the only 3. You could have as many as you can think of, you could write down for these basic rules. But the 3 we gave on page 9 was, they are living, breathing members of the human race. They have goals, abilities, and potential. And they can build a positive character and be productive members of society. And of course, looking back over to page 52, you see 3 different examples. You can be polite and courteous, recognize the value and worth of all people, accept that people are unique and have different beliefs and values. And when you think about that, and I'm not here to knock on the military or anything like that. I'm not here to knock on anybody in the military. But when it says recognize the value and worth of all people, I would love for someone, and this is so far reached, it's unreal, because peace doesn't make money. War makes a lot of money. War is great business. It's a huge business in society. But how can you recognize the value and worth of all people by developing a system that is meant to destroy and take lives? And how can you bring peace when we're doing that? Think about that when it comes into respecting others. Because if we're teaching people to disrespect others, you're never going to get a positive from a negative. And if your end result is to bring peace, taking lives is never going to bring it. Looking down to the first paragraph here on page 52, it says, these 3 rules of respect can be demonstrated to everyone you come into contact with. Respecting all people on this basic level keeps our society civil. So if we do these things that help protect and keep people safe, then we have a civil society. If you have an uncivil society, that means you have a society that's unruly. Remember, they don't live according to the rules. And society, as we learned in the character unit, is a group of people that live by the same common body of rules. When some people reject those rules, then it becomes very different. If it's considered murder, if I go out on the street with my gun and I shoot someone, if that's considered murder, then why, if I take my machine gun and go into Iraq and shoot someone, why is that not considered murder? Well, we've defined them as the enemy. Well, have we defined them as the enemy because we've identified the problem? Or is it because we're not willing to look to see what's causing the problem and causing enemies, and we just want to annihilate people? And how is that respect? And how can we even teach that that's respect? And keep that in mind as we go through this. Here down in the, look down to the second to last sentence of the first paragraph. It begins with, you might not know them personally. Well, let's read the example. We need that. For example, the cashier at the store, the security guard at the mall, the bus driver, or the conductor on the train are people just like you. You might not know them personally, but they too have value. And if you think they don't have value, get on a bus and start taking a bus ride, like I seen here on the news a couple weeks ago, and the bus driver got mad and walked off the bus. He didn't want to drive it no more. Left everybody stranded on the bus. You know, you start realizing, yeah, he was a pretty important guy. But with that right there, also moving along, turning back over to what I've learned, because we're going to get into the next bullet point, and we can put up the next slide, please. And it says that the respect I show for others can be measured by the way I interact with them. So continuing what we've just talked about, turning back over to page 23 or 53, page 53. I know the person calling me has got to be watching class, so I can't answer your phone call. It's hard to do a FaceTime call when you're teaching class. Familiarity breeds respect. And once again, we're talking about the respect I show for others can be measured by the way I interact with them. And notice here it says, respecting the people you know personally helps to build strong, positive relationships. A relationship is simply the way you relate to and interact with others. So you can have private relationships. Of course, you can have intimate relationships, which are appropriate when you have certain situations that are within the rules. You can have friendly relationships. You can have business relationships. There's many forms of relationships. And it says there are many different kinds and levels of relationships. But for example, you and your parents have relationship. Relationship also exists between you and your siblings, friends, and teachers. That's just to name a few. Obviously, having grown up with your family, you will feel more comfortable around them than with your baseball coach. You will also feel more comfortable around a friend you have known all of your life than a person you have just met. But notice here, becoming more familiar and comfortable with someone doesn't mean that you should ever lose respect. Because familiarity breeds respect, but sadly it can also breed disrespect when we start losing the value for the people in our lives. Continuing on, it says, becoming more familiar or comfortable with someone doesn't mean you should ever lose respect, although some people tend to become less courteous, caring, and polite to others when they become familiar with them. This is unhealthy for any relationship. Remember that respect in all interactions promotes the relationship. So that respect is the foundation. It's the supporting role, so to speak. It's the glue that holds everything together, or the nails, or the screws. If you've ever had something together that's held by screws and you take the screws out and it all falls apart, well, that's what occurs in a relationship when respect is removed. It all falls apart. And sadly, most people will experience a failed relationship in their life, one that they actually committed to, one that they had intentions of making it last forever, and forever ended up being 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, and it falls apart. And these things really shouldn't take place. A lot of times, it's that familiarity that they got used to. It wasn't everything they thought it was. They thought they knew what they wanted, and then they got into something, and then it wasn't what they expected. And of course, then the disrespect starts, because now I don't like you. Why? Because you don't act like you used to. Well, you don't either. I only change because you change. And that tends to grow and fester and eventually blows like a volcano. But notice all positive relationships are supportive and caring. Supportive and caring. And of course, when you get to know people and you work with people, you can learn how to be supportive and caring. Doesn't mean always going up and patting them on the back and saying it's going to be okay. Sometimes it's helping people through the situation. Sometimes it means getting your hands dirty and working with them. Or sometimes it means just doing or helping someone else accomplish their goal. Helping them, knowing when you actually get involved. And this is what the author of The Peaceful Solution, Yisrael Hawkins, taught for many years. He had a goal, and when people seen that goal and got involved with him, which are thousands of people, that goal became very realistic, not just in a small community, not just in a state, but now it's global. And it has spread all around the world, where many people are seeing this is what needs to be done. And it started off with respecting others. 2 wrongs don't make a right. That's one form of respect, by not giving in and doing something to retaliate, by holding it and trying to find the solution. Well, looking over to page 54, it says getting to know others. In order to build positive relationships and be respectful toward others, you must be aware of their needs and feelings. Now, this doesn't mean that if someone's standing on the side of the street and they got a cup out and they need some change or $1, that you notice their needs. Obviously, if someone's out on the side of the street, I've always, and I was taught this from a very diligent teacher, I will try to help them find the job, because me putting $1 in their cup's not going to help them. That $1's not going to last very long. Help them find the job. Help them find something where they can benefit themselves. And I can tell you, we've actually turned people like that into instructors of the Peaceful Solution before. People who didn't have anything, and I can learn this, and it can be a benefit. Yeah, it can actually be a paying job. None of us get paid for it. The reward is the work that we do, and that's what we look forward to, and that's why we work so hard at it. But obviously, there are some people in the Peaceful Solution that they spend their whole life doing it, and it's really important that they do it. And yeah, you can't do it all for free. The food doesn't fall from the sky, and unless you have one of those self-filling refrigerators, you're not going to make it. And when you have teenage children, you sure would like to have one of those, because it needs to fill every day, it seems like. There's no food ever left in something where there's teenage children. But this respect, once again, others might not be enjoyed being spoken about to in a certain manner. To be respectful, both you will need to adjust your tone of voice. Let me do that one more time. To be respectful to both, you will need to adjust your tone of voice. In other words, what one person might think is disrespectful, another might think is okay. And that's one thing you learn when you get into different languages. What is spoken of in English that's considered okay, you can say in another language and it's not acceptable at all. You will get people turning their head looking at you. But moving on to the next bullet point, with that in mind, moving on to the next bullet point, we're running out of time faster than I thought we would. But here we look at the third bullet point, which would be the next slide, and it's words, body language, and facial expression convey whether care, concern, and interest are being shown. This demonstrates respect. So looking over to page 55, and notice we have here, communicate respectfully. And it says over half of your communication skills are noticed based upon body language alone. It's just like reading. When your glasses aren't working right and you grab the wrong pair, it's hard to read. Over half of your communication skills are based upon body language alone. And we'll get into, once we get into the high school unit, the difference between words and the tone of voice you use to say them, and even the facial expressions that we show when we say them. But here in communicating respectfully, notice it says communication is another aspect of showing respect to others. We communicate in many different ways. The most common form of communication is by speaking, but did you know that you also communicate with your body language and facial expressions? Communication incorporates many different factors such as words, facial expressions, body language, and tone of voice. And it became such a challenge when our technology kind of increased with smartphones, for one, where texting became such a huge thing. And it very quickly became something that was noticed that you need to kind of show whether you're angry or joyful or sad. And now you have a world of emojis to go with your words so people can understand, well, what does that mean? Is he yelling at me, or is he smiling at me, or what is he doing? Is he going to come help me mow my grass, or is he going to come set my house on fire? I'm not for sure which one he's going to do from what he said. But you think about that. And when you think about texting, you can now communicate many different things just by sending emojis. And I know people that when you ask them a question, they answer with emojis, and that's all they answer with. They don't send words, and you can understand them perfectly. And that's very interesting when that can be done. But here's an example. Crossing your hands and slumping into your chair tells others that you do not want to hear what they have to say. When you read that to your classroom, everybody always sits up, they wake up, they shake their face, and they kind of get back in gear with it. But notice it says, in like manner, rolling your eyes when you're being instructed to do something says loud and clear that you're bored with what you're being told, or that you do not intend to follow the instruction. No words are said. It's just pure body language that's being shown, and that communicates the reaction of the person that's hearing what's being said. Communication also involves listening. When you're a great listener, you give others an opportunity to express their wants, needs, and feelings without being interrupted. The roles of speakers and listener are automatically designated during normal conversation. If both people speak at the same time, neither would hear what the other is saying. And if both people are listening at the same time, there would be nothing to listen to. And if you've ever had someone that's talking to you and they're telling you something that's really important to them, they're going through something, if you've ever been married, you've experienced this. Sadly, us men have the ability to do this. You come home and your wife is telling you about something that's really important. And you're going, yeah, yep, yep. And then comes the scary part when they go, what do you think we should do? And you're like, about what? And that's when I realize that you try to find the best way of saying, I wasn't listening. But here you have someone that, and think about this, it's something that they think is really important or they feel is really important, and you were the person they brought it to for the answer. Now, how would you feel if you went to someone, and we can do this to each other, not just husband and wife, but, men can do this with their friends, women can do this with their friends. But here you're pouring out your heart, trying to see what someone thinks, and they get to the very end of it, and it's like, what? And I've got friends that are some of the best listeners in the world. I've always admired how well they can listen. And one time I had a very great teacher talking to me, and he goes, I'll wait till you're done. And I'm going, no, I'm listening. He goes, I'll wait till you're done, because the whole time he's talking, I'm doing this, trying to answer questions. Coming from overseas, people were asking me questions. And he was right. I could hear what he said, but I wasn't listening to what he said. And there's a big difference between hearing and listening. Because when someone has something important to say, we really need to listen. Not just hear the words, but listen to the words. And that helps us to find a better answer, or an answer in general. But turning over here to page 56, notice you also have the language of respect. And at the very top of the page it says, have you ever heard the expression, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me? Well, guess what? It's a lie. So next time you hear that, it's a lie. Anybody that says that you can try to say that. It's like saying, you can punch me in the gut and it won't hurt. I promise it won't hurt. And you get punched in the gut, and it's all you can do to hold it in to show that it didn't hurt. And people do these things when they're young and in school, and they do kind of crazy things, but it's a fact. Speaking negative about people, being disrespectful to people hurts, and it hurts deep, hurts very deep. Words can hurt. They can be a form of abuse. Remember, we talked about that in the second chapter of the character unit, that verbal abuse can be more damaging than physical abuse. Bones that get broken heal, but emotional hurt from spiteful, mean, and uncaring words can have a lifelong effect, and they're very damaging. Respectful communication also involves controlling your emotions so that you can refrain from name-calling or teasing others. People name-call and tease others for different reasons. The two most common reasons are to put someone down or to make them feel bad about themselves. And just imagine, if you go by somebody, don't have to say a word. And if you're standing in a group of people and you're like, what are you telling everybody? You're pointing to them and, that person stinks. And then you walk off and you realize when you walk off, wait a minute, I still smell it. It might have been yourself. Surprise. Everybody else was looking at you going, whew. And I've seen that take place before. I thought it was humorous because somebody learned a lesson. Don't know if they kept it with them, but they learned a lesson that day. Continuing on to the next bullet point, if you go back to page 68, we put up the next slide. Number 4, respect for others by being considerate of their feelings and needs. So being considerate of their feelings and needs. And if you look over to page 61, notice not just the way they feel, but also the things they need. And one thing people feel and need and we've covered this, but I want to make sure everybody understands it. One thing, and whether people acknowledge it or not, one thing we feel and need is to be valued, is to be accepted. Now, morally, when we do things that are morally correct, to be accepted. If you're doing something that's immoral, a positive society is not going to accept you. And there's problems with that in society, to where everybody feels that no matter what I do, I should be accepted into society. If what I'm doing is bringing harm, well, it's my right to bring it to myself. Well, it's a proven fact in society, when you have something that brings harm to yourself, it spreads pretty quickly. And it can spread very quickly. And I'm speaking of disease or anything else, that you're doing that brings harm to yourself that can be infectious. And just being a negative person can be very infectious. But here on page 61, it says, don't let the fact that someone looks different stop you from being respectful and polite. I want to look back at something real quick. There's one more thing we want to add to it. When you think about the conformity and the peer pressure that goes into this, also remember what we're addressing here. It says, other ways to consider, always consider that to another person, you might be the one who looks different. Treat that person in the same manner you would want to be treated, putting yourself in someone else's place, and even considering how that person would feel is called empathy. Having empathy plays an important role in learning how to accept and respect the difference in others. It is a positive character trait that's worth striving for. I can tell you, here about 2 years ago, I went to a location and I watched lots of people cross the Rio Grande River. A lot of Haitians. There were thousands of people around the bridge. And then we had an event, and they built up, I think they got up to 15,000 people. We had an event here in Abilene at that time. And I seen people saying that these people need to go back to where they came from. Well, I've never been to Haiti, or as they say, Haiti. But I have been across where they were just coming from. And I heard someone say that, I don't know why people cross that river. I said, well, get in my car, I'll show you why. If I was on the other side of that river, I would spend every day trying to cross that river. Why? Because I know what's on this side. And is there more peace on this side? No. We have just as many murders in Abilene, Texas as everywhere else. People get stolen from, people mistreat each other, but there's more opportunity. And life is much easier on this side of that river. But you watch people and you think about how far the journey of someone from Haiti or the Congo, how far they've traveled, and their goal is just to get across that river. And they have no idea what's on the other side of that river. They just have these dreams and stories they've heard. And they'll give anything. And now they're flying to Canada and coming down through the north side. Why? Because, well, you don't need a visa to get into Canada. So they fly there and try to walk across. And it's just hope of having something better. And sadly, they don't realize that it's not what they've seen on TV or the movies. America is a very difficult place. And I know people that, went through a legal process, were legally established here in the United States. And, they called me and said, I never realized it costs so much money to live in the United States. I always heard that, where I come from, if you made $15 an hour, you were beyond rich. $15 an hour here, I can't even pay my bills. It's like, well, you had to get that $1,200 cell phone, and you had to get that, 75-inch plasma TV. You had to have that new car. I notice your clothes are always new every day. You're dressed really nice. I can't afford to live like you either. And people start realizing this American dream it's very different than what people think. It's very, very different than what people think. But people are willing to die to come try to give an experience. And it's something that it's very challenging to watch people go through that. But here's something else. Notice at the next paragraph on page 61. Respecting others also means treating those who are mentally and physically challenged with compassion and consideration. Have you ever considered how different life must be for someone who is blind or in a wheelchair? And one thing I've always been interested in learning to do, and I don't have a clue how to do it, and we've actually been working on trying to develop a system for Peaceful Solution books, is Braille, because that's a group of people that we haven't been able to create a book for, and we're trying to look into that. We've been doing it for quite a few years, and we think we've about got something where we can do it because it's important. We have the books on audio where people can listen to them, and we did that because we found out there's a lot of people in society that can't read. When you can't read, sometimes you don't quite understand the words either that are coming forth from the book. But also people like that, you know. But I want to bring up one more thing before we close. It's even people from different walks of life and people who go through different things, sometimes even their voice changes. And their voice will sound different. Somebody can have dentures put in, somebody can have teeth removed, somebody can have injury to their mouth. And imagine what that feels like when children go around and start mocking people or start trying to make fun of them. Now, how respectful is that? It's extremely disrespectful. Or someone gets a hurt leg, or someone has a hurt back, and here's someone trying to limp around and act like them. Oh, I'm dying. Where do you get that from? Well, I've seen him do it. You know, it can be extremely disrespectful and extremely hurtful to the people, and you might not know that you hurt them. But they'll tell somebody. And if you see anybody doing it, especially you young men in this auditorium, you've been trained for years in the Peaceful Solution. These are something that nobody here should ever fall victim to. You should never be made fun of, and you should never make fun of someone else. You know, and keep that in mind. We're going to continue on with what I have learned, and we'll get into the next chapter with the next class. We're going to stop right here. The next class will be on 3/29/2023. That will be in a few days. It was important that I remembered what year. So it'll be this Wednesday, and it'll be at 5:30. I want to let everyone know, though, this next class will be our last class for a week because we're planning for a huge Peaceful Solution event to take place here, where we're going to have a lot of people, not just speaking here, but a lot of people speaking from all around the world. So this Wednesday will be our last class for 2 cycles, and then we're going to start back again. But we're going to have a huge event that you can watch online. You'll be able to see it live. And, of course, it'll be up there where you can watch it later on also. So our next class will be 3/29 this coming Wednesday at 5:30. Thank you for joining us.